Good morning, everyone. Oh, come on. Come on. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, much better. Okay, after our first keynote, who here is feeling a little bit anxious? We got some anxious people out there. Who here is feeling very motivated? Yes, love to see it. That's the energy that we want to keep flowing through today. So we're so excited to have you join us for an amazing program for the next few hours. My name is Jen Graham. I'm the Senior Associate Director of the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. And it's been a true pleasure to work alongside Chris and Brian this past year, as they and the rest of the summit team have poured so much heart into making today's event a success. One of the team's goals this year is to spark more conversations around climate change and resilience, especially among attendees today. One great tool to do so is our Whova app, where you can check the latest agenda, read speaker bios, connect with fellow participants, and join in some meaningful dialogue. We'd love to see your voice in the community conversations today. Now I'm excited to introduce our next panel, No One Left Behind, How to Make Climate Resilience Equitable. As the climate crisis accelerates, adaptation efforts must wrestle with a crucial question: resilience for whom? This discussion will bring together experts in urban design, emergency management, and community planning to explore how we can ensure that resilience strategies work for everyone, especially those who are most vulnerable. Leading today's conversation is Carlos Centeno, Program and Engagement Director at MIT Emerging Talent. Carlos has spent his career advising inclusive innovation, from co-leading public sector design work at MIT GovLab to shaping humanitarian responses for the UN World Food Program. His work focuses on using tech and human-centered design to empower displaced and marginalized communities around the world. Please join me in welcoming Carlos as well as our panel.
Hi, Miho. It's good to see you. Good to see you. I'll take the last seat.
Too short for the chair.
Right. Welcome, everybody. I have the least impressive resume here, so I'm going to ask all of our guests to take a minute to introduce themselves and tell us something that is on their mind right now, something that's challenging, nagging at them, something that's exciting, and so we can get to know you a little bit, and then we'll get into some good questions. I know we might have caught you off guard, so we're going to start with Christoph.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Christoph Reinhart. I'm a faculty in building technology architecture here, and I'm also, for the climate project, one of the mission directors on resilient and prosperous cities. Not fully sure why I'm on this panel. I'm really a data person, so I can model how people will feel in buildings everywhere in the world, how much they're going to pay for their energy use. But of course, since we have all this power now available that we can make this kind of predictions, I'm really excited to hear from my co-panelists how we make this information available to everybody for a positive change.
Hi, my name is Kendra White. I am the Climate Resilience Planner for the City of Cambridge. I recently moved to Cambridge from Australia, where I was working for Australian Red Cross in their disaster preparedness during historic wildfires. I am on this panel because of my background in both disaster preparedness and social resilience, which really is a key tenet of resilience in all of its forms. So I'm excited for this conversation, and I think that, like we heard in the speaker before us, there's challenges ahead of us, but there's also a lot of hope, and a huge part of that hope is connecting community members together and finding the strength in numbers that way.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marcus Coleman. I serve as the Vice President for Community Resilience Strategy at United Way Worldwide. United Way has 1,100 United Ways across 37 countries. What brings me here is not just my current work, but my former work as the director for the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the Department of Homeland Security. I think the question that's on my mind is where I sit at United Way is one of 70 national organizations and several hundred faith-based and community-based organizations globally that are thinking about some important questions on how we can take data-informed decision-making, risk communication practices, and finding different ways to get local and state governments to work with faith and community-based partners to address many of the issues that were talked about in our prior panel and that will be discussed throughout the day.
Hi, everybody. My name is Miho Mazereeuw. I'm a colleague of Christoph's in the Department of Architecture. I also teach in urbanism. And I run a lab called the Urban Risk Lab that works on preparedness within cities and communities, really through a design angle. How can we design and build our cities to be more resilient? And I'm also the Climate Mission Director for Empowering Frontline Community Action. I'm excited to be on this panel, and I'm all fired up from John Sturman's presentation. I do think it's this win-win combination of mitigation, adaptation. There's so many strategies that actually really increase economic output, increase the livelihood resilience of frontline communities. And so I would, excited to be on this panel with all of you.
Thank you all. And yes, I'm also fired up from Professor Sturman's presentation. And it made me think about my background before MIT. I worked for 10 years in the United Nations World Food Program, which it's not just about food, it's a leading UN agency during natural disasters and emergencies, because food is very expensive to transport, and so logistics is involved, and that's the first thing you do in an emergency. So my role was working with communities and data teams to design preparedness and recovery operations in communities in Central America, Africa, and Asia, especially those in hotspots, climate change hotspots. So one of the things that came to mind listening to Professor Sturman is this idea of fighting for what we believe in and not listening to deniers or people who are saying it's not worth fighting this. There's people who've been fighting for this for years, for decades. I remember working in Guatemala in the drought corridor. And I remember speaking to a farmer there, and this is 2009. And my team was there to talk about building terracing for water capture. And the team was talking about climate change. It was kind of a big topic back then. And the farmer said, what are you talking about? We've been doing this for 40 years, 50 years. We've been dealing with more rain than we can take, less rain than we can take, shifting planting seasons. And in Turkana in Kenya, in the pastoral region, it was a similar conversation. One of the pastoralists was saying how 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was a lake where they used to fish, and that lake didn't exist anymore. And there we were, trying to come up with some sort of preparedness and recovery plan, feeling like idiots. But people have been fighting this for decades. So my question to the panel, to provoke the panel, is why this panel? Why now? Why are we talking about no one left behind today? This has been going on for a while. And anyone who wants to start.
Sure. I mean, when we look at the data today, on the one hand, I think we can say in many parts of the world, people have been dealing with hardship for a long time, but we are also at a moment where we see the effects of climate change in certain parts of the world differently than we ever did before. So we are basically entering a stage where parts of the planet become hostile to human survival, and you kind of see that when suddenly during the Hajj, 800 people die. It's not that practices had really changed. It's getting warmer, more humid for longer in different parts of the world, and so we have to basically acknowledge that when you go into countries such as Portugal, all over the Mediterranean, where people don't have didn't used to have air conditioning, and now it's getting warmer. They are buying air conditioning. Those who can afford it, there's energy poverty. So there are changes that man-made changes that happen ubiquitously to the planet, and trying to be prepared and being able to predict where the worst outcomes are and hyper-locating where the most vulnerable populations are is I think, imperative for us to do.
I'll say for me, John actually spoke to this in his presentation. Interests are aligning to address this issue in a way that I think it's hard to appreciate, especially for those that have been involved in a lot of conversations around climate for a while. This coming Monday, you're going to have business leaders from the Chamber of Commerce coming together to discuss what the business interest is going to be. I think it's no secret that the economics of disasters and of climate-related disasters are extensive. And to see the private sector want to step in and really move towards steps towards mitigating communities is one area. But on the other end of the spectrum, I was with the American Geophysical Union in December, and there they had several pastors, a rabbi, someone from a federally recognized tribe. And in that space, you had people that had thousands of years of history, either through their faith or through their cultural institutions, sitting alongside scientists, but geologists, meteorologists. And the common thing that they talked about in December was that this is one of the few times that there's an appreciation for what communities and frontline communities offered through their indigenous and community and contextual knowledge, with the humility, which can be hard to come by for some of the hard sciences and social sciences. And so I think interests are aligning in a way that as we continue to be in dialogue and discussion with one another, we're able to come up with some solutions at the intersection of what has been some of the newer technologies, but then of course all of the various technologies from just historical times. So
I'll add to that as well and say that I think previously when speaking about climate adaptation and resilience and mitigation, it's been very much an environmental perspective, but you've seen possibly more articles and things like that highlighting the fact that it's also a humanitarian issue. And from an environmental justice perspective, we are seeing frontline communities who are experiencing the impacts of climate change faster than other parts of our own communities. It's not this far off thing that happens in other countries and other places that we can so easily ignore. So while we move closer and closer to the worst parts of climate change, we're seeing the impacts here in Cambridge, knowing through data and research what it will look like if we don't take action. So I think the conversation around a bottom-up approach and seeing the strengths and the vulnerabilities, but the opportunities for communities to be able to tell municipalities and other organizations what they need. They know what they need, they know what their experience is, and it's up to us to be able to listen to them. There's two other quick things that I'll say. One is that, to your point, I think it's, there's some research that shows $1 in adaptation saves $10 in recovery. Money talks, and I think that that is something that needs to be discussed more often, and in terms of getting grant funding and maybe one day federal funding again, we'll be able to use that kind of information to make larger capacity building initiatives on the ground level. And lastly, from a social resilience perspective, we call them zero responders, but emergency services, governments, we can't be everywhere all at once, all of the time. So I think building up that social cohesion and the social resilience in communities, whether they are an environmental justice community or beyond, is really giving them the ability to handle a certain amount themselves and to be there for each other and be there for further communities as well, which I think is a really important thing to bring up.
Yeah, I agree with all my colleagues, and what you were just mentioning is what John mentioned about building civic muscle, right? And I think that that doesn't cost very much. It's go out, get to know your neighbors, understand how you can support each other through different events. Going more internationally, where you started, I think that it's true. We should, there have been organizations and people, community members who have been struggling through these kinds of events. I think now, and we should have started years ago, it's what John mentioned about North Carolina. So I've been working on this for decades, and I have Google alerts of all the places in the world that I'm worried about that keep going bing, 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 bing. But North Carolina was not on that. And so I think places that people have been used to the fluctuating drought and flood situations will be better off regardless, because they have years and years of this kind of preparedness and practice in it. But there will be locations where this is not something that they're expecting, and the devastation there will be enormous. And so I think that there are several strategies that do address the conditions at that adaptation mitigation intersection. One, of course, we talked a little bit about afforestation and limiting deforestation. But wherever deforestation happens, the sediment flow into reservoirs then fills up the reservoirs with sediment, and then flooding happens. And so there's so many things are interconnected in a circular way. And I think as we try to start to work even more to support these prime locations where the two intersect, the more we can do to benefit both sides of the coin.
Yeah, and I want to jump into, with you, Miho, actually. You have a book coming up on the culture of preparedness. And I know it's focused on Japan, but I was wondering if we all can dive into this, in how do you build a culture of preparedness in these places where, you know, you're mentioning places that are more resilient because they've been dealing with this for a while. But how do you build a culture of preparedness in places that have not had to feel the impact of a worsening climate? I know Philippines gets 21 typhoons a year. They have a certain level of know-how and resilience, but even the Filipino government, just as an example, struggles to build up its preparedness budget because they just keep replacing that budget into rebuilding after disasters that have happened and eroded their capacity to respond. So thinking internationally, but also here in the US, how do we build a culture of preparedness in an environment where shifting politics here in Europe, wherever, might make it very difficult for local governments, so I'm looking at Kendra, for local governments to do their job? Let's start with you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's true that Japan invests a tremendous amount in this. And so but the book really tries, and in my work, I try to understand the benefits of it that can be reached with less economic infusion. So I talk a lot about dual use design and everyone being all hands on deck, where it's not siloed into these are funds for preparedness and these are the only kinds of programs that can be funded from that. But for example, if you're building a park within the city, then understanding how that park can also respond as an evacuation space, or designing it so that it can also host temporary shelters. And so really every dollar we spend on anything in the city could have this understanding of how the dual use design could work. And that way you're not separating out funds. Of course, there should be dedicated funds for sort of training and social engagement on these topics, but everything else could also have this dual use idea behind it. And so it's very difficult for all cities, even in Japan, to really place money for an if-then situation, right? But I think that as we come together, get community input into the design, there's so many things that through the process of co-designing, you're already doing that preparedness work with the community around it. And so whatever it is that you're designing for within the city, well, from that process, starting at the ground up at the very beginning stages of design, can already have that preparedness work embedded in it. It doesn't have to be an extra thing that's placed on top.
Mm-hmm. How do you find that that's true in your work as well here in the city of Cambridge, Kendra?
Yes, absolutely. I'm only 8 months in, actually, to my role at the city of Cambridge, having just come back from Australia. And I won't lie, I was a little bit nervous to come to the US and work in this space because I felt as though they were doing such extraordinary work in Australia. I didn't think that there would be the same kind of level coming here, but I was very, very happily surprised when I came to Cambridge and saw how much emphasis they were putting on social resilience and co-design and community engagement. So, you know, as an advertisement for how great the city is, we do have an entire team of people who are looking at language justice, for instance, to make sure that the initiatives we are doing in co-design are easy English and are accessible to all. And that goes for our climate initiatives as well. We just launched a new website called Sustainable Cambridge. So that is all in easy English as well, so that we can include more people in the conversation. In terms of what you were mentioning, Miho, in sort of multi-use spaces, there's a couple of things that were already in place when I came on that I am going to be furthering now. One of which is a project by my colleague Claudia Zarazua, who's doing Shaded Social Justice. Yep, love the smile, it's a great project. So essentially to address the heat impacts in Cambridge and extreme heat, we've got a shade structure that was done through the Arts Council as well. So these beautiful shade structures throughout the city. But they're really meant to also be places to gather and to have those connections with people that you might not necessarily see in your everyday life. There's also an initiative with that around teens, where they're actually co-designing and leading the programming within that shade structure. We did a lot of research to find out, like, where are you going after school that you need to stay cool? And it was McDonald's, because they could get fries for $1 and charge their phone. So listening to what they actually needed from these spaces, but knowing that they would have another impact besides that. And also our resilience hub that we're working with at the moment with the Cambridge Community Center. So I think this would definitely link in with you, Marcus, in terms of working with community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, meeting people where they're at and understanding what their strengths are, like I had mentioned before. And with the CCC, it was their community programming and the amount of people that use their food pantry, et cetera. But now we're also sort of layering in energy efficiency and possibly some training around psychosocial first aid and some other initiatives to kind of use that as a resilience hub in extreme weather, but also in peace times be able to have that be a place that people are strengthening their bonds. So I think the city is doing a really good job of trying to balance that. And I don't want to take up too much time because I know I'm a talker, but it's been really amazing to see, and I'm sure once everyone else has a chance to speak, I'll be able to give some more examples.
Of course.
Oh, good. So, I mean, I'll say from the social service and human service sector, I think one of the things that's true for all of us is, right, we are very mission driven. For United Way, we often talk about mobilizing the power of caring communities to help people thrive. What that means is when we talk about building a culture of preparedness, it's going to look a little bit different than in every community. Dual purpose is a good way to say it. Many of our United Ways across the globe often are doing dual purpose projects that lend themselves towards thinking about climate resilience in specific ways. 3 quick examples. Hyderabad, India, for example, our United Way there, one of the things that they needed to address was access to clean, fresh water, but then also reducing exposure to just trash. And so one of the things that they did is they've invested heavily in bringing together industry, engineers, community workers, and have actually built and restored various lakes in the Hyderabad area, which serves 2 purposes. Again, walkable communities, communities where people can convene, feel proud, feel dignified, but then still have that access to water. Second example, the Collier Keys here in Florida. The issue there is you have the coral reefs that unfortunately continue to be damaged and destroyed, but then that also affects tourism. Dual purpose use, the United Way through several investments, including an investment from the UAE, have been doing coral restoration projects, but along the way are introducing a whole new slate of workforce development programs around tourism and around eco-friendly related other jobs and things of that nature. And then the third example is a pretty cool example to the park. This is not a United Way funded effort, but a cool effort that I learned about a few years ago in Colorado, where a particular community had an issue with repeated flooding, didn't know what to do. And they had a park, but the park couldn't necessarily retain water. So they actually built a skate park that served a dual purpose of 2 things. One, giving youth, young adults, or skaters at heart for life, a place to skate, but then when the rain came, it actually was able to hold a lot of the water management there. So I think when we talk about the many faith-based and community-based organizations, I think oftentimes, even when you look at places of worship, you have a number of places of worship that are very mindful that as they build, especially now, that they have to be mindful of some of the environmental impacts. And so they're building with rain gardens in their mind. They're building with the intention to provide areas from extreme heat. They're building with refuge in mind. And so I think that there's a few examples that continue to build. I'll say what we need more of and this actually goes to Chris, is knowing and understanding the data and some of the modeling that can help inform how things are built and designed with communities. So.
Nice. Nice transition. Yeah, I get to that. Also, Carlos, I really like your question. I think it's really profound. How do we ever convince people that haven't been affected by disaster that disaster is going to strike? And I was trying to think of any example in history where that happened, and I can't really come up with any. And I think this is really tragic in many ways. So I think it nearly always has to happen, and it feels like when it comes to climate disasters, our ability to ignore it and say couldn't happen to me is incredibly high. Like if you think of Jakarta, this mega city that is, if you don't know it, it's disappearing, underwater, overuse of water locally, sea level rise. So this whole mega city is disappearing officially. South Beach, Miami is next. I mean, there's no question that this is going to be the case. You don't see necessarily real estate prices plummeting, people leaving there. And all the information in the world is there, so I'm really befuddled. I don't know what we can do to basically convince people. Fire hazards, I mean, obviously, after what we saw happened in LA, to some of the most affluent communities in the world with infinite funding to protect them, didn't work, didn't help them. And still, there's all this bickering right now. They're probably not going to rezone LA to create meaningful corridors to protect different parts of the city. So I think what we can do is try to, I don't think it's very effective to come afterwards and say, told you so, because you are never really anybody's darling when you do that. But I think now to be very vocal about risks that exist and talk about them, like about Miami, and I have nothing, I think it's a great place, South Beach. But I mean, saying these are really the next places and we should be doing something about it. And then the question is, what do we actually do about it, right? And so I think it's important that MIT, which is why we launched the climate project, that we are building here technical capacity, which we are pretty good at, like really worldwide data sets on climate actionable information about urban assets, for example. But then it's incredibly important that we have local partners, because if we are just saying it, nobody's going to listen. So we have to find the NGO and the partners that then basically use the information and translate it into something that local citizens can understand and believe.
And there's something about this this logic of like those who have gone through it for the past 20 years or so, they're more resilient, whereas the others, how do we convince them? That gets at data, the availability of data to make decisions, to persuade people, like Professor Sturman was showing with his dashboard. You've been working on data a lot, and how cities, and I might be butchering what you do, but what I got from it is how cities can make better decisions based on the information that, I think it's called the SMBE. I don't know the acronym, but maybe you can tell us more about how, is Kendra's, sorry to pick on you, is the city of Cambridge doing enough with the tools they have? Can they use other tools that are out there to make better decisions for the inclusion of everyone?
Well, that's a great question. We released an app actually yesterday. So those of you who live in Massachusetts, it's called MABI, the Massachusetts Building Inventory.mit.edu. It's a web app. It's like a Google for buildings. And we just looked at it together. You can basically type in your own address, you answer a few questions, and it gives you credible information about, it guesses your current energy use, and we are guessing, we didn't sneak on you. It's surprising how well we can actually predict what you're currently using. And then we can give you information of what you can do and how much it's going to cost to reduce carbon emissions. And I think these are very productive collaborations that we can do. We actually worked 10 years ago with Cambridge on a solar map, which then spread across the whole United States, where you could basically look at your address, you can draw a photovoltaic on top of it, and Cambridge has been a great partner there on promoting it, and that was really fantastic. So I think I feel really good about the relationship we have here, and I wish we had that everywhere, that I think academics and local governments work close together.
Yeah, I think in today's climate right now politically, that sort of public-private partnership is so important with the lack of federal funding that we're seeing. You know, Cambridge itself has lost millions of dollars towards resilience efforts and some of our mitigation efforts. So really leaning on your more local community and on those partnerships. And so, you know, from our perspective, we're hugely, we're spoiled, basically, having MIT and Harvard right at our fingertips and a very engaged and educated population within Cambridge. So one of the things that I thought of when you were speaking was just the opportunity here to combine mitigation and adaptation, which I think is a very important aspect. Mitigation has been the star of the show for a very long time and getting to net zero. So, you know, even within Cambridge, even though we're perfect, you know, there's, I think, 10 people in mitigation, and I'm the one resilience planner. So it's up to us to get creative how we can kind of, I always say, like, hide the peas in the sauce. So, you know, right now we're looking at doing a Cool Roof technical assistance program in the next financial year and embedding that into our Electrify Cambridge program, where you're getting technical assistance into residential buildings to see if people are eligible for heat pumps or weatherization, solar, and then also trying to do cool roofs. Any opportunity where we can combine those things, I think, is a positive, but the data really has to help us form a proof of concept to not just kind of throw things out there. And I think for Cambridge in particular, Carlos, one of the questions you had for me earlier was, you know, in terms of our demographics of Cambridge, we're not necessarily known as having the largest environmental justice communities statewide or nationally. And I think our role in this, you know, we do still have environmental justice communities. 33% of our residents speak English as a second language. I think something like 60% are renters and don't have control over some of the options that are happening for their buildings, so we focus on that. But we really are trying to lower the bar for other communities as well. Like, we are in a very privileged space to be able to work with people like Christoph and to get this data, and we want to make sure that we're working regionally in partnerships as well. So through like the Resilient Mystic Collaborative or through the Metro Mayor's Climate Task Force, things like that, where we can really sort of spread the love and see, you know, the pilots that we're doing and are able to do are actually being beneficial beyond just Cambridge.
Can I add one more thing? So I think too, this reliance on government or reliance on someone else is something that needs to change. And so really understanding our own actions and our own stewardship of our community. And so I'd love to flip this back also on the audience and some of the discussion later of how prepared are you? How do you take care of your communities around you? And we worked with Cambridge on flood maps for a very long time, and then we did the same work within our own buildings on MIT campus. And we learned that a lot of the flood modeling tools do not consider what a building is. So a building is seen as a concrete block in the flood modeling tools, but buildings have windows and doors that all allow water to flood the basements and first floor levels. And so we did what we called a big porosity hunt with Mitos, who's a supporter of this summit, and had students go around and see where all of the windows and doors that could let water into the buildings where they occur, and then fed those back into the model so we understand if there's a flood event, all of the labs, all of the student spaces that are in the basement floors, what would happen to them. And I think those kinds of having people engage in the data collection also really helps with this preparedness and understanding of what you are responsible for in your own community.
And I am so glad that you brought that up, because then I don't have to do that part. But I was about to get into the idea of this thing I mentioned in the beginning of communities already fighting this stuff with their own techniques, ancestral techniques as well, community techniques that I've been doing for years. And it's going well for Cambridge, it sounds like. Very happy for What about the subnational level cities, small cities, peri-urban areas, rural areas? I've worked with government a lot, because in those areas, the almost like the power is concentrated there in the local government in terms of financial resources, but also connections. How do we work on things like this porosity hunt, for example, these tools, some of the data for decision making that you work on, Christoph? How do we connect to those subnational level governments, remote area governments, but also associations and organizations at the community level, so that we actually flip it? Here, it's we have a lot of resources to do it, and this question is for Marcus and Miho, both.
Sure. So there's always going to be people with great vision, but for most, you can't be what you can't see. And so one of the areas that I've been focused on for the past few years, specifically as it relates to mitigation, is looking at the different connecting points that you can draw an arc explicitly between different things in mitigation. I'll give you an example that actually has come up in Cambridge and a few others. Thinking about the role that arts and culture plays in helping people understand their risk, take action and connections towards prior times in history, and building towards a better future is critically important. Last year, we had worked with several faith organizations specifically to develop a guide for expanding mitigation specifically with the faith community, and taking some of these very practical examples from different faith traditions to talk about ways that the faith community can come alongside others, including government, but often with private industry, to expand that mitigation conversation. It was part of a series that exists in some form or fashion online. And it looks at different things like agriculture, arts and culture, like I said, the faith example. But I think a lot of it has to be giving very concrete examples that not only demonstrate the data and information to say this is important, but that can begin to paint a roadmap where you have different examples of people coming together across different lived experiences to model ways that they might have addressed issues in the past. I know at United Way, we actually held a convening this past February with about 50 different organizations, from GoFundMe to Verizon, the UPS Foundation, the Adventists, Islamic Relief USA, Buddhist Uchi, and we were all coming together to really speak about how do we lean in on this moment where we know communities are going to be impacted by disasters. We know they're going to have less government support than they might have anticipated, and we know that when those disasters happen, that's going to be, unfortunately, the best opportunity to pivot them towards mitigation and adaptation practices that can help them think about how to withstand what comes next. And so I think a really key element of it is bringing some of the examples from Cambridge, bringing some of the other examples from subnational places and spaces, and elevating them up to some of the groups like United Way, like the Red Cross, like others, to help show here's what you can do, and here's ways that we can mobilize. And so I'll say it's gotten a bit trickier over the past few months. Can't lie about that, but I think it's still something that a lot of groups are very keen and interested on finding different ways to start the conversation to make investments. And as I mentioned, the private sector, in more ways than you know, especially the insurance industry, is very interested in finding new solutions to think about how to do advance adaptation and mitigation conversations.
Just for context, I remember, I can't remember the exact statistic, but in the countries where I worked, in East Africa mostly, and the drought corridors in Latin America, I remember specifically that we worked with church and schools, because the trust that people had in those institutions was so much higher than government, for good reasons. Probably also the church is infallible in terms of God is infallible and all these things. But I think the community that's built in church and the community that's built in schools, and I think, just to contrast, maybe in the US is not as much, but in a lot of the world, that's where some of these initiatives take hold. And they are led by the community, not necessarily by the pastor or not necessarily by the school teachers. But that's where we would do emergency operations and food distributions, and anything we needed, they were open their doors. And that's why it's really interesting. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have, I think, going forward. When we talk about how communities, this question I had, how communities can actually take some of these methods and tools and technology. Miho, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. The faith-based leaders and community leaders that the trust is so necessary in everything that you do. I would add to that then many places, for example, in Indonesia where we've worked, where the design of those temples or mosques or churches have that dual use embedded in them in terms of their resilience to the kind of disasters that might serve around them, but then also be off-grid, and so that they can operate during those times. But then the off-grid part is also great, because then you have solar panels on the roof every day as well. So I think that trust piece is really important. And so one project that we're working on in Thailand is called CoPin. It's short for collective pinning, but also coping capacity. And for that, we developed this platform that they use for the everyday use of different villages being able to share their local products, and really sort of small businesses being able to engage with each other and understanding who the community leaders are and who the more vulnerable population is. And so it's something that the communities we're asking for, because in a lot of cases, government officials come in and they collect data and then they leave, and that data is not available for the community to use. And so this is a platform that they've been asking for, and we co-created with them. And I think that is another switch where the government's not coming in and telling them, use this app, but we were there doing field work, and even things like elephant sightings, that elephants come and destroy the crops. Like, how do we immediately, in real time, alert each other about elephant sightings? So these kinds of everyday needs are built into this platform. And then when there is a flood event, they're all connected, and they're able to communicate with each other and coordinate with each other. So really embedding all of this work into everyday activities is important. And then to answer your other part of your question, I think Christoph and I do this quite a bit, but releasing these platforms to be open sourced or working with local universities so that their students and their faculty are also engaged in being able to use this information and then share the data across.
Maybe to add of that, I think this is where really the climate project comes in. I think generally a lot of individuals in academia work on their own field and are really good at that. And I think MIT at least has a track record of bringing people together, because the trust in the mighty dollar is to basically have a spin-off. And that has been a driving factor, clearly, of this university. But I think through the climate project, to create similarly these teams that look at other maybe necessarily profitable venues that are still important, such as these platforms, I think we can only do that here in the university, and there we hope to work with philanthropy and public sector once that money flows again, to basically make this knowledge available everywhere. And then I think the same information can be used by the insurance industry of North America to pinpoint all houses that they want to insure, but the same platform can also be used in, you asked me earlier about Sierra Leone or somewhere else in the world. We can actually kind of co-fund this, hopefully, so that it's a global set of information.
And when they say we talked previously, we didn't ask it here, but we've been talking for a while, just so you know. You didn't miss nothing about Sierra Leone.
Could I actually just add one more thing before you jump on to the next question? I just wanted to touch on some of the equity around this work as well. And again, I feel like I'm a broken record, but in today's political climate, people who are immigrants or who aren't citizens yet, holder of green cards, maybe here illegally, they are afraid to go out into public spaces. And I think it's really important in this moment and at all times to take that into consideration with these projects that we're doing. So working with faith-based organizations and community-based organizations is a lot more approachable for the people who we really need to reach in these preparedness conversations. And so I just wanted to add that in there, because I think in Cambridge, it's maybe not as easy to see, but even with students and everything else, it's palpable from the city perspective that we need to make sure that we're being inclusive in every way that we can. So that was my last little thing.
Oh, that's a great segue to, we talked about elephants. See if you're awake. The elephant in the room. So I can't go to questions to the audience before we ask that question, and you mentioned it. So we're talking about how communities can can take hold or continue to sustain that fight, how has that shifted, and how should we be, all of us, I don't consider myself particularly an activist, but we are all activists in some way through our work. How has that shifted, and how would you see your work shifting with the current political environment, not only in the US, but other places too?
We're getting creative. I was speaking with a resilience officer from the city of Boston who just wrote a massive grant proposal for climate resilience for flooding, where they were not allowed to use the words climate resilience or environmental justice. And
So it was just a grant, nothing else.
Yeah, and so I think for us from a infrastructure rather than from social resilience on this side of things, for getting the grant money to be able to sneak into social resilience, we have to look at how it infiltrates every part of the city. So Department of Public Works or our Department of Public Health, things like that. So we're not applying for environmental justice communities heat. We're applying for a bus stop shelter for better transportation. That, so you're trying to find ways to still get to the end goal while not putting too much of a red flag around what you're doing. And I think Cambridge also is a special place in that, we talk about suing the administration and things like that to try to at least show the intent, whether that goes somewhere or not. But I think that really is a huge part of it, is not backing down and continuing business as usual as much as we can. And again, the privilege that we have in Cambridge is that in terms of our climate team, while we did rely heavily on federal funding, we do have a lot of operating budget that we can still continue our projects and then continue to work with private partnerships and partnerships with universities.
Just to add on to that, I think the way that you described it actually may come up with a lot more of these dual purpose, dual use. So maybe this challenge is actually, we'll try to be optimistic about it as we can, but we need to double down, and we need to double down the work that we do with communities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll say I've been reminded, and I often have to reappreciate that thankfully we come from people and cultures and are surrounded by systems that have been around for thousands of years. And I'll say I get this most frequently from some of my colleagues who are very clear that, a lot of what's going to come next is going to rhyme. So I think if we use history as a teacher, there have been often opportunities where we can look back towards tactics, tools, and strategies of things that rhyme. And I'll give you three. First is money. So again, the International Chamber of Commerce talks about, over the past 10 years, $2 trillion of economic impacts from disasters. The US Chamber of Commerce, as I mentioned earlier, just released a report sponsored by Allstate that looks at the economic impacts. And so one of the areas that money speaks to is consequence. There's a lot of mobilizing, organizing, and help that every sector is going to need to manage the consequences that are going to continue to come as we approach summer disaster season here in the Northern Hemisphere and winter storms. The second is community. So every movement, every moment, every opportunity to shift change in a meaningful way happens in community, and it happens at a very hyper-local level. It's going to be the neighborhood in Cambridge, or it's going to be the neighborhood in a subnational area that's going to probably lead the next set of ways that communities come together to mobilize in a meaningful way. And then the third, it's an extension of community, but it's finding the spaces of collective influence. Some organizations, the UN Environmental Program has a wonderful collection of faith organizations around the world that have been pushing and have been talking about how to bring together all these various interests through the lens of faith. Here in the United States, you have the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, 70 plus organizations. And increasingly, I think what we see with all of the shifts and changes for how federal government is beginning to realign itself in its role as it relates to mitigating and adapting to disasters is what's probably going to end up happening is that somebody else is going to have to decide to go first. Now, who wants to get first on the dance floor? I don't know. It's going to feel like a middle school dance. It'll be awkward for the next few months. But somebody will get to dancing, and I think it's probably going to be some students from MIT. So.
Yay.
Hey.
That's great to set the stage for audience questions. We have a few here on the app, but I might break protocol after a couple questions and ask someone from the audience after if they have questions, because you might not have registered on the app. We'll take the first one here because they got voted and everything. So we have to believe in democracy right now. It seems like a lot of the inequities around climate resilience are a result of a lack of funding in low-income communities. How can communities with limited funding afford to invest in adaptation measures when their more immediate needs, like food security, are not met? Now, this question was from Milani. Thank you, Milani.
That's a very good question. I think it's important, kind of what we've been speaking about before in terms of what Cambridge is doing, recognizing that we have environmental justice communities, using the data to understand where we need to do targeted outreach, and hearing from them what their needs are before we just come in and say, here's what we're going to do to help you. So I think working with municipalities and community-based organizations, I mean, it's the same thing. It's finding ways to maybe work regionally to get money to help out and address those immediate needs while building capacity. I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen both with my role at Red Cross and also in my role here in Cambridge for resilience hubs is that the want is there from community to do more for themselves and to be resilient. It's the cost of actually doing the work and the mental load and the lack of staffing in a lot of these organizations that the challenge really lies in. So this is very much a work in progress, and I wish I had like the golden ticket to be able to say, oh, this is what we're gonna do and it's gonna fix everything. But I think where it starts is having really deep community engagement and understanding of what the needs assessment is, and then working from there to see what kind of funding we can use to address those and actually empower those communities to do some of this themselves as well, so that we don't just give them a bunch of information and then step away. We want them to be able to have that capacity.
I would like to expand on that. And I think the clear message is really that a lot of the vulnerable communities will need some economic support to change. And what I really mean with that, I'm getting asked a lot right now if during the current political climate, like the renewable energy, the high performance buildings, if this is all stopping. And I don't feel that when we work with industry, because these things are, if you have the funds economically, they pay for themselves. If we don't do anything, in 15 years, higher income Americans will have a solar cell on the roof, they have a battery, they have an EV charging, they have no utility bills, and they live in more comfortable, healthier homes. That's just gonna happen. And the thing is, it's not gonna happen everywhere. And of course, this whole polarization that we see everywhere is gonna be even more so, because then if you don't invest and it's initially expensive into homes, then the homes will be poorly insulated, use a whole large amount of natural gas. There are only a few people that use the natural gas. And it's like a vicious circle that really pulls us apart. So I think these initial investment are just really critical. And if federal funding pulls back here, like a fraction of society will just keep on going, but then it doesn't help the climate, doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I agree with my colleagues, and I think that one other thing to mention, though, that a lot of times these communities will have much more social capacity embedded in them. And so a lot of research on their response has shown that that capacity within these neighborhoods and community organizations are so strong that we need to find ways to continue to help and foster that to grow, and that doesn't cost very much. That's not a lot of funding. So that's one point I like to make. The other thing is that a lot of this green technology is still very, very expensive. Like, we're in this lovely LEED Platinum building, but to understand how we can make much more of this technology, both for adaptation and mitigation, less expensive, easier to maintain, so that globally it can be used more in more countries, and that we can find ways. And I guess this is really for the MIT community to not only be inventing the new thing that will change construction in a very small sector, but really focusing on how do we invent things that will be affordable across the world.
I think this partly answers the next question, so if you want to jump in on that too, but Miho, maybe. How do we balance the long-term benefits of resiliency and climate action with the short-term costs? For example, stricter housing codes in Massachusetts may increase energy efficiency and resiliency, but may also increase construction costs and worsen the housing shortage here. Thank you, Alexander, for that question.
I have an opinion on that because we are finishing a study on that where we looked at the last 15 years in this country. This is like one of these archaic, there's probably not a lot of you are aware of. So the way the building energy code in this country works is there is no building energy code that you need to have. It's up to individual states to decide if they want to adopt one or then. And there's a frightful number of states that don't have any. So you need fire code, but you can do whatever you want with respect to your building. But the federal government gives out a model code. So there's a difference between what states adopt, and they're usually 5-10 years behind, and the actual code. And we looked at 15 years, and basically the states that lag behind cost their constituents $8 billion in savings that they would certainly have had. And then there's a handful of states that have more stringent codes than the energy code, and they made $500 million. So I think there's an argument, of course, which is used a lot, that if we put some efficiency measures in place, and I'm not talking about the shiny things, I'm not saying this building, I'm just saying a little more insulation in the wall, like very basic things. These things pay themselves back so quickly, all within 2-3 years. This is really an argument that not fully holds, even though the home buyers associations of the world want to show us. But when you actually look historically, when the actual new building codes were put in place and the cost of housing, they don't move at all. So obviously this can be absorbed. Maybe you get a countertop that's half an inch thinner then and out of granite, but not the shiniest thing. These things can be controlled. So I think this argument seems compelling, but if you look more careful, some really basic things that our codes are pushing for are not radical.
And I think from where I sit, I think it's going to be a matter of scale, scope, and stick-to-itiveness. And so when we talk about scale, you have the International Code Council and then Build Strong America, very strong proponents of the building code conversation. But when we talk about the scope of the problem, it doesn't always have to be big. To your point, it can be very discrete, very focused. And I think that's where the stick-to-itiveness comes into play. Tying back to the last question, I think one of the ways that we're going to be able to help, particularly think about the equitable distribution of investments to make communities more resilient, is actually going to come from something. There's a speaker later today, Jasmine, Replus Connected, I've had the honor to meet, that literally leveraged her skills, expertise, and insights, and then embedded herself with the community for a long period of time to start building resilience where that community was. And so similar to something that you said, the goal isn't to take all of these tools, tactics, and expertise and put on communities what they should do. The goal is to embed and then co-create and think about what can we do at the scale of the problem that it exists for the everyday lives of folks. That is a long game, but again, we've played that long game before.
So a little bit of insulation for the whole world and a little bit of hyper-localism goes a long way. I have 2.5 minutes. I want to see if anybody in the audience has a question.
My name's Colleen.
We're streaming, so what's happening?
Oh, okay. Great. Hi, My name's Colleen. I work primarily with small businesses on strategic sustainability, and I'm curious about, for businesses that don't have a budget for significant philanthropy or volunteerism and don't have industry influence because they're so small, how can they, bolster their communities, engage in climate resilience when they might have 10 employees, not a lot that they can just donate or fund?
Well, listen, you can go to unitedway.org, and we have plenty of volunteer opportunities. No, I think that the small businesses are part of that social infrastructure and social ecosystem. By nature of being a small business owner, you may have employees, you may have access to technology, you may have assets, and you may have a point of view. It takes a little bit more creativity, but I don't think that it's always going to be dollars. A lot of it's going to be sweat equity. And so the recommendation I'd make, you can go to unitedway.org, as I mentioned, or you can go to your other nonprofit of choice, but then start the conversation for your business. How can we continue to remain economically viable, knowing the challenges we have in front of us? So for example, if you have a small business that's a construction business or a lawnmower business, they got a lot of interest to think about what climate resilient things they can do to withstand extreme heat and extreme shifts in weather. And so I think for businesses, it's like the same thing from the community-based perspective. You can start where you are, and that's completely okay. And then once you become a billionaire, you make a few investments, and then you can solve it at a bigger scale.
I like that. I also, depending on what the business is, two things come to mind from that question. One is for your own business and success of having a business continuity plan around, what could happen with climate change, and depending on what your services are for the community, making sure you're still able to be there for them if some extreme weather event happened and things shut down. And then the other side of that is if it's like a cafe or something like that, looking at how you can build social resilience through using it as a third space, and really blending those links and bridging ties that don't necessarily exist in your normal hours, and putting some kind of focus on it around climate or something like that. That still is sweat equity, as Marcus said, but still something that you can do that is a form of activism and not necessarily putting dollars towards it.
All right. We are at time, but I wanted to. Do you want a quick one? Yeah. Oh, we need a mic.
Hi, my name is Naz. I am currently a graduate student at Harvard University. I study sustainable development and global development. And I am a part of an organization called the SES at Harvard, and it's also a larger organization. It's involved in volunteer work, climate resilience, community work in mainly student groups from all over the world. So 175 different countries, and there's 190 something different countries in the world. So we're really, really involved in trying to achieve the global UN SDGs by mobilizing students who have the passion and the drive to attack these goals through all different types of actions. So we do cleanups, we do educations, we do all different types of work. And here in the Cambridge area, we've been really, really looking to how can we get involved in the communities here, and especially with all the amazing initiatives that are going on. Kendra, you're the number one person I had this question for. Okay. But, for example, how do individuals, how do groups who have this passion, this drive in mind to serve the community, where should we direct our efforts? I feel like the ones who know the best about what a community needs, they're the leaders, they're the people who are directly spending every single day engaging with the communities. Mm-hmm. But there's also groups who have the passion and the will and the want to get involved. But we might not necessarily have that direct contact with someone who is facing a very serious problem or is struggling with climate resiliency. So I feel where would you direct individuals, volunteers, or just students who are passionate about making these changes, and how do we start those connections and build these partnerships so that we're able to actually serve?
That's amazing work that you're doing, first of all, so thank you for doing it. And it's a great question. I would say the short answer is you can get my email and we can chat. But there are a lot of opportunities from within the city to engage directly with our team and the climate team. We've got the climate committee, which is made up of community members and stakeholders that represent all of Cambridge to help us inform what we're doing in the climate team, including community engagement and opportunities to kind of reach those extra communities. But I will say it's actually kind of overwhelming in Cambridge. There's so many organizations and nonprofits and local groups that are trying to do really amazing work. So one of the things I'm currently working on right now is actually just creating like a register around all of those organizations and volunteer opportunities. So let's catch up after, and I can definitely give you some tips on what matches well with what you're doing.
Thank you.
Well, I hope we answered the question of no one left behind, although I hope more questions come up afterwards. You can come up to our speakers and ask those questions. I think what I take from this is hyper-localism is where it's at. It's where it's always been at. Going back to our beginning question, it's where people have been doing it for decades. So ask yourself, how can you be an activist in your own line of work? Because you don't have to be out protesting. You absolutely can and should, but you can also be an activist within your own line of work. And I think this is the time, it's always been the time, but this particular time we really need everybody to join and feel the urgency of this, what Professor Sternman called, I think, a burning world or a world on fire. Mm-hmm. That's well put. So thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and very much looking forward to the other panels that are coming up.
Can we get one more round of applause for these guys? Thank you so much. That was amazing. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael. I'm one of the student organizers of this event today. I am going to be very quick because I'm standing between you and a break, but I'm also going to be thorough because I'm here to thank our sponsors for this event. Chris mentioned at the beginning of the day that we are so grateful for the sponsors because they're really what made it possible for us to be in this space and welcome all of you here today. So I'm going to be quick, and I'm just going to go for it. Starting off with our MIT sponsors, we're really lucky to have a community here at MIT that is willing to support all the students that are making this event happen. So starting off with the Sloan Sustainability Initiative, JWAFS, the Abdul Latif Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, the MIT Climate Project, MIT D-Lab, the Sustainability Science and Strategy, CS3, and MIT Executive Education. So could we give a quick round of applause to all the MIT partners? And then moving on to the community sponsors. And if I shout you out and you're in the room, give us a wave. Starting with the Born Global Foundation that do really amazing work with youth to help them understand and get involved in sustainability. So is there anyone from Born Global here? Right here. Amazing. Sienna Construction. Do we have any folks from Sienna here? I know they're here somewhere, but they're a local construction firm just down the street in Cambridge. They've worked on a lot of buildings in the area, and they're very focused on sustainability. So check them out and meet some of the folks from Sienna. Thought Forms. I know Mark's here. More than just a wave. Mark, stand up. Mark, who is actually a Sloan alum and has been very supportive of the initiative, you should absolutely talk to him. He's also a former professional bike racer. So if you're interested in that, he has lots to say. I would highly recommend Googling Thought Forms because they build these incredible buildings that are focused on sustainability, but are phenomenal. They're beautiful, well-designed, and there's many throughout the Cambridge and Boston area. So at the very least, go talk to Mark, and otherwise, Google what they do. It's really incredible, the work that they do, and we're so grateful for Mark's support of the conference. So one more round of applause for Mark, please. And then the last sponsor that we want to thank is our planetary sponsor, Context Labs. They're an enterprise carbon management SaaS company, and they were actually spun out of MIT Sloan, so another sort of homegrown sponsor. They have a room down this way, so to all your left. They're doing demos all day. So they have some folks from their team can show you the work that they do. They work with energy companies around the world to help them understand their carbon impact. So I did a demo earlier. I would highly recommend checking it out. And they're our one sort of planetary sponsor. So we're really, really grateful for them. And let's give a round of applause to them as well. Last thing I'll say before I let you go to your break, the sponsors today, they're folks from all of the labs I mentioned and the other sponsors. They're here to get to know folks, so seek them out, talk to them, have conversations, and I know they'll be excited to meet you all.